perhaps one can only learn about composition as one can only learn about making color by actually making pictures, lots of them, and getting to grips with the problems as they turn up. Artist and author Bernard Dunstan. This is The Artful Painter, art lessons for artists, collectors, and people who love art. Chris Kolupski began painting outdoors as a teenager in the forest of upstate New York in Canada. He credits his high school art teacher, David DeClerk, for making a significant impact on his early artistic evolution. DeClerk took his class on outdoor painting field trips and introduced his students to representational American painters and illustrators such as Winslow Homer, Norman Rockwell, and the Wyeth family. Like many artists, Chris pursued career choices after high school that helped him earn a living as an illustrator, as a portrait artist, and taking on commission work. However, after a particularly exhausting large-scale commission, Chris had had enough. He felt depleted, and he looked forward to unwinding by painting natural landscapes outdoors during a Utah and Colorado vacation with his wife Michele and their 2 children. That trip would prove to be a pivotal point for Chris. Inspired by the striking landscape of the American West, he resolved to focus on his first painting love, landscapes. In this episode, Chris talks about that transformative moment and why it was so important to him in his development as an artist. He talks about why landscape painting appeals to him, and he shares a few of his outdoor adventures. He talks, too, about the effect his portraiture work has on his landscape paintings. He also talks about the materials and techniques he likes to use and his thoughts on teaching. This conversation with Chris Kolupski will certainly inspire you to paint outdoors, seek its solitude, and disappear into time. My name is Carl Olson, and this is The Artful Painter. Chris, it's great to have you on The Artful Painter today.
Well, it's great to be here, Carl.
Well, I first saw your work. I saw a Facebook post, Instagram post, and became intrigued with your artwork. You were advertising some of your classes, some of your workshops, and talking about your travels. And I was really inspired by what you're doing. So I'm really grateful to you for taking the time for the next few minutes to talk about your art and what inspires you.
Well, I'm happy to do that. Thanks for reaching out.
You are a multidisciplinary painter. Portraits, landscapes, and the style and approach to painting is very different in some respect. At least to my eye, with your portraits, are very realistic. Realism is prominent there, and yet your outdoor paintings and your landscape paintings have a beautiful looseness to them. Both are beautiful styles, but I want to know where that comes from.
I didn't plan that. It's kind of developed because of, I would say, changing course in my career. I started as kind of a tight. I don't want to say tight. I would say a very kind of a refined figurative based illustrator, and then I think I reacted against it because I had been doing it for too many years. And I came to a point where after, 15 years of doing these types of illustrations, these very, again, I don't want to use the word tight, but small form focused illustrations. I kind of discovered, I thought about the painters that I really liked, both through history and then currently alive, and I could see they're all strong mark makers. Not like I was painting. So these painters, I could go through a long list of them, but the tactile quality of their paint was always present, whereas I was tending to blend away my brushstrokes. And these guys and gals were aggressive painters. Another commonality is these painters are all very strongly individualistic. In other words, their aesthetic dominated. They would reorganize reality according to whatever their aesthetic values were. Even if they were completely different from one artist to another, their unique vision would always come through their work, no matter what it was they were painting. And that was probably because they would edit out or exaggerate. We can't see what they saw. We could only see their work. Yet I had to admit that I was still tending to render. In other words, I felt kind of shackled to duplicating my subject matter. Now, of course, in the portrait business, that's what you're expected to do. And as well as in the illustration business, if you've presented a comp sketch, your client expects the final illustration to look like, what they were presented with. But here, these artists that I was really liking could evoke their subject matter without copying every detail. Sometimes I figured they had edited out most of the scene. So I had to decide the way I wanted to paint, for the rest of my life. I said to myself, why would I hold my own work up to this precise and stringent ideal of reality where everything had to look like the scene? And so once I kind of identified that, it gave me permission to kind of give into my impulse to be more aggressive with my paint handling, to enjoy the marks my brush was making, not to fiddle with them, and also to be more aggressive editing out stuff and changing things around. And I have to be honest, I didn't produce great work for a while. I mean, even now, I think I'm probably 50-50, what I like, what I'll show, and what I don't show. But when I really did this kind of a transition, I would say I produced close to a year's worth of work that was a little too experimental to show people. But the process freed me from the tyranny of reality, making everything look exactly like I saw it. You are right in noticing that I'm kind of two types of painter. I think I have finally decided that I'm, this type that we're talking about, that riding that edge between realism and impressionism, trying to imply detail and symbolize form more than directly render everything.
Was this a gradual thing, or is it something that you'd always wanted to do and just didn't feel that the circumstances permitted at the time?
Well, I started as a very free painter. I in high school, my art teacher, David DeClerk, he was a watercolorist, and he was a loose watercolorist. He was also architectural renderer. So right off the bat, I had this dichotomy of a guide, or a person that was guiding me who was both loose and tight, depending on the objective. If he was painting for himself, it was loose. If it was for a client, it was tight. And he introduced me to other aggressive painters, Winslow Homer, the Wyeth family. My art teacher, David DeClerk, would take us outdoors, and he'd literally take us to the woods out behind the school. There was a creek there. The students would set up on these fallen logs across the stream, and we just paint. And it was very freeing and liberating. I remember these dead salmon, pink salmon, washing up on the shores. All these kids would paint the water. It must have been in the fall of the year. He would take us out to our Lake Ontario here. We're not far from Lake Ontario. And yeah, the kids would paint all day. We'd have a cookout. I got addicted to that kind of painting, loose, free outdoor painting. And then my family would go to the same cottage in Canada pretty much every year. And there was no TV. So we would fish, play cards, and I would go out in the woods and paint watercolor and free. And I would fish and paint off the boat too, paint the Canadian rock shield wherever the granite would poke through the water. After high school, though, I think stuff started to tighten up. I started doing freelance architectural illustration. I got a 5-year job. This is before there was CAD, so you had to lay out the perspective.
I remember those days.
Absolutely, old-fashioned way. And so stringent pen and ink, watercolor, again, tightness, precision was valued. And then I worked for the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society in the art department there. And again, this is a place where stringent accuracy for their biblical, historical illustrations, it was valued. And so that's what I did when I left Watchtower. I set up an atelier. I continued this sort of rigorous drawing. I had taken some classes at the Art Students League, and I continued it. I think that if I was to pinpoint a specific instance, I had this huge job. It was a big mural. There were 57 figures in this mural. It was for a corporate client. I say 57 costumed figures. It was a grueling job, and it was very academic, small form rendering, very close, tight palette. consistent palette across 57 figures, and they were undersized. So we're talking 1.5 feet maybe tall, tiny little heads. So there was little sable brushes, there were magnifying glasses, and there were years of work on this thing.
How large was it?
It was probably 8 feet wide, 9 feet wide, maybe.
Yeah,
like that. And like I say, you can find it on the internet. If you Google School of Priority Thinking, it'll come up. But it's not the way I want to paint now. And so all that hiding my brush work, I kind of was, you can feel trapped by it. So at that point, I sort of rediscovered my first love of landscape. I had been always teaching landscape in the atelier. There was always a summer unit that we'd go outside and we'd paint. But I think right around the time I was done with that huge illustration, I was out in Telluride, and we walked in they were taking a show down, and I don't know what it was. It was definitely a plein air show. And I literally walked in the side entrance of this gallery, and still on the wall was this little landscape. I don't know who did it. I could say I kind of looked like a Scott Christensen small field study, but I don't want to, I can't be sure. It was a sun hitting a distant mountain range kind of over a swampy lake. What it was aggressively painted. And I stood there, against this backdrop of tiny sable brushes and rendering. I stood there awed by the total lack of rendering in this little piece, how much this painter had accomplished with so few brushstrokes. I bought this cheap French easel. It's funny, you'd think you'd be going out west and you'd want to paint and you'd bring your supplies with you. I didn't. So I bought the worst possible easel, just enough paint to get going. I went up on top of the Colorado National Monument. That's
a beautiful place.
Oh, yeah. I'm glad you know about it. I don't know if enough people know about it. It is gorgeous. Yeah, and there's a lot of places where they have their fenced-in view stations, and then they have paths that go right out to rocks, and you're on your own. There's no fence there. And so actually that's where I was this particular time. I was painting something they call the coke ovens, just out on an edge. And it ignited the desire to paint outside. But I was on this pretty close to the edge of a cliff with about a 1,000-foot drop in front of me. And I was impressed by the fact that I could not hear anything. I'm looking maybe 50, 70 miles, probably in some cases, I'm looking 100 miles straight in front of me, and I can't hear anything as I'm painting. And here comes this hawk spiraling, riding one of these giant thermals up, and he whips past my face, and I hear the cut of his wings. And it was so loud in that silence that I just kept watching corkscrewing upward. And I remember that was the experience that really made me say, I've got to get outside and paint as often as I can.
Oh, that's an amazing mental image. And I've seen that. I've seen that right there, that very same thing. That the silence is golden.
It's amazing when you're on the edge of nothing and you can see so far. And there's this weirdness of, is it real? Is it really 1,000 feet straight in front of me? Because you cannot hear anything that would indicate so much vast space is in front of you. So yeah,
Well, what's that like when you're painting with your family? Your family, are you out there by yourself, or do they go with you to those locations?
They come with me. They're usually staying either at the campsite or at the cabin or wherever we are. But they do come up on the hikes sometimes. In fact, if I can, I'll try to get them to paint. Both my daughter and my son have painted with me. She's 14. He's 8. Even if it's just a couple of brush strokes, they like that. My son, in fact, I've actually gone out and painted with him a few times, and he naively, the kid is very talented, but naively, I've seen him whip out like a couple of tree paintings that have like stopped me in my tracks and made me think. Totally naive eye, but his lack of having bad habits or any habits sometimes has caused him to really produce, I would just say, very true representations of things, and it's impressive.
Well, what locations are you drawn to paint, and why?
I live here on the East Coast, or I should say I live in New York, but I like out west, I think. I mean, I don't want to undermine my local painting. We have the Letchworth Park around here, of course, just farmland, just beautiful farmland. And I pretty much love painting whatever I see and wherever I am. But something about the Great American West, just the vastness of it and the desolation of it. I love the age. Sometimes I kind of think I'm disappearing into time or something if really nobody's around and I'm in front of some of those formations, and especially in Utah. I would say it's a pretty spiritual experience.
You know, when I was looking at your gallery, I noticed you do have an affinity toward the Western landscape, but yet you don't shy away from your backyard, as it were.
Right.
So there's a diversity in the way you paint, very expressive, and you can see that love of the landscape, no matter where the location is. That comes through beautifully in your paintings. When you first started painting, you painted primarily the human figure and portraits.
It seemed like a better business decision than gallery work. You know, getting 50% down on the contract and then 50% on completion, which is the way my portrait business has always been. That seemed to make more sense than building this big inventory of paintings and then trying to sell them. But that's exactly what I do now, and I like it better, actually, than a commission model. I still, of course, I'm going to say yes to portraits when they come. I'm doing a portrait right now. I'll probably always do portrait paintings. But my preference would be to get outside and then paint bigger studio landscapes.
Well, I think what's interesting is it's true as artists or any profession that we go into, or hobby for that matter. There's a certain amount of pragmatism. You know, you have to do what will bring in the cash that will allow us to continue to do the things that we want to do and the things that we need to do. And yet, you know, there's a danger in that. You know, the work could look perfunctory, but that's not the case with your portraits. They're full of life. I mean, you seem to be capturing the essence of that person's personality. There seems to still be this exuberance of painting the portrait when I look at them. How do you maintain that discipline, even though it is a commission work?
I guess I did it long enough, you know, and I'm not saying I've graduated from portraiture. No, it gets rusty if you don't keep up with it. But you know, the years and years and years, and I would really say the many hundreds, maybe thousands of faces it gets into. I would also say I try to have empathy with the sitter. I try not to think of them as you know, just a lump of clay or a lump of rock. I'm trying to get their personality into the portrait when I paint them. So it's intentional.
What lessons have you learned from painting portraits that have carried over to painting landscapes?
Drawing, good drawing. I mean, that's a big thing, is just if you're going to paint a portrait, you have to get it right. And so all of that definitely has made it, I would say, easy to transfer to landscape painting. But I would say the biggest thing, aside from drawing, would be organizing and controlling my values. Sargent, we think we painted with 5 values. He painted with 5 values. I know Scott Christensen and a bunch of others pretty much limit themselves to 5 values. Bouguereau painted with a wider range of values because he painted, I would say, most of the halftones in. But all those figurative and portrait painters knew how to budget their values extremely carefully. Graydon Parrish is a painter who, at one point, he was running a website called Rational Painting. I don't know if he's still running it, but for years I was in that, you know, just looking at what they were talking about. And I'm not really, I don't go there anymore. But the Munsell system, which is it's basically a way of mapping color in 3 dimensions, hue, value, and chroma, but specifically the values. You asked about portrait painting. So the controlling the values and understanding what they were. I mean, I lived half my life as an illustrator and portrait painter before I really understood how to budget values or how to control them. So my budgeting values, especially the gray values from like 0 to 10, has totally affected the way that I paint landscapes. The way I mix my colors, I do pre-mix my colors, and they are organized according to groups of values. And that is all from portrait painting. another thing too, I would have to say is color sensitivity. I mean, I did study with Nelson Shanks, although more, I didn't really get far enough with him to get into his color. I was mostly monochrome with him, but I mean, the reason I was with Nelson Shanks is because of his color sensitivity. I was very impressed with his color. So again, landscape painting, I'm probably always pushing color just a little bit. I think Shanks pushed color. He had a background with Henry Henchy and some of those, the Cape Cod school, and then the Impressionists. So he got his color sensitivity from outdoor painters, even though he was a portrait painter. And so he would advocate blurring your eyes to see color and doing different things to really get the color, because our eyes will kind of fool us, and I would say counterbalance the colors that we see, or mix in the optical opposite of the colors that we see. So to paint well, we have to kind of get ourselves to objectively see those colors, and so that is definitely something I do when I'm painting landscape.
Yeah, that is a tough lesson to learn. I have to admit, I'm still working at trying to defeat the symbologies that are in my head. Having to do with color and shape and how things are designed and so forth. There's just this heavy symbology in our heads that we have to overcome.
It's funny you mentioned that. I'm actually going back to it. Don't stop trying to overcome it. I know what you mean. You have to objectively get. You have to objectively get the shapes as you see them. But kind of going back to Clyde Aspavig, he said once, this brushstroke symbolizes that tree. And I've seen his sketches. We had they showed all of his giant amount of his sketches at the Remington Museum down in Corning, and I could literally see in his work. This is his aggressive work, his racing with the sun type of sketching, and you could literally see the way that his brush under the pressure of the moment was just doing like a cliff note version of reality, and yet you stand back a little bit and it's just amazing.
Well, what do you consider when you are deciding what aspects of a landscape to paint? Let's say you're out in the Colorado Monument there. There's no shortage of things to paint, it would seem. So how do you get down to the process of saying, I want to paint this? Right.
Well, thankfully, I mechanically restrict what I see by squinting. That is, using my my eyelashes and narrowing my gaze so that what makes it through to my brain are the strong, simple shapes. And so there's, like you say, you're up there walking around, or out in Utah in Arches State Park, I think, for instance, National Park, and there's everything is a painting, but really everything is not a painting, because when you squint down, you see what's actually paintable. And so I walk around squinting, cropping. Of course, then what comes through are the bigger contrasts, the big value, specifically the big value shapes. I would say, though, another thing, you said, what do I decide to paint? Sometimes all that goes out the window because I'm seeing an interesting light effect, and I immediately have to paint it, and all that deliberative kind of a choice goes out the window. When that happens, 50-50, whether that painting will be lousy or terrific. Usually there's no middle ground when I'm in the heat of the moment and I think something's awesome. It either is a spectacular failure or it is a spectacular little painting. I learned a big lesson a few years back in a competition about subtlety. There was, of course, you can go after subtlety or you can go after big punchy kinds of things. So I did what I thought was this gorgeous subtle picture, and I was very proud of it. In fact, I think I put it in, there was like several competitions. In that competition, I put it in the big one because I was so sure of it. And when it hung on the wall with everybody else's work, it like disappeared. It was pretty much gone because it wasn't contrasty enough.
Now, when you say it was subtle, and it wasn't contrasty, are you talking about its colors?
Values in the half-tone range. In other words, a lot of the painting was on a value scale. It was between, say, 4 and 6, as opposed to going to black, 0 on the Munsell system, and up to 10 or 9.5. So it wasn't punchy. And also, it was complicated. It wasn't strong and simple. So again, I know from that kind of experience that if I can see strong, simple shapes with a big, wide range of contrast, it's a pretty good chance it'll translate into being a good painting. Of course, that deliberation can also kill a whole afternoon. So another thing I've learned is don't walk around looking too long for the perfect thing. Don't be too precious about what you're going to paint, because every day, if you're going to spend the whole day painting, there's going to be couple of not so good ones, and then maybe you'll get a good one. In fact, I psych myself out. I'm like, I will sit down and say, okay, I got to get the first bad painting out, and I'll just paint this thing,
Yeah.
I remember there's this formation called the Potholes, not far from Grand Junction, and big bouldery things and water shooting through. And I had painted a couple of these really tight studies that I was kind of proud of them. Later, they turned out to be boring, and I've never shown them. But after that, I was tired out, so I plopped down on a rock, and I sat, and I usually don't sit. And I put my box on my lap, and I just painted some boulders with rock shooting, or with water shooting between them. And years later, I looked at them, at these boulders, and I'm like, this is a terrific painting. I didn't see it for years because I was focused on the other ones. And that was a result of not deliberating. That was just a result of painting what I had right in front of me.
One thing that comes up in conversations with different artists that paint outdoors, you have many who it's an ends to a means as far as, competitions and plein air sales, and that's fine. That's what they do. But many other artists that I talk to, they view plein air painting as an experience to learn, to inform future paintings. Where do you fall in that between those two categories?
Well, it's changing right now. I love Matt Smith's work. I know he tries to finish a painting either outdoor or take it in and touch it up later. And so part of his objective is to finish paintings and sell his plein air paintings. Of course, I'll still do that, but I'm kind of using it more as a study. I would say in the last few years, I've gone out driving around looking for little things, and I wasn't really intending to sell them. Turns out I have sold a bunch of these littler ones, 6x8 ones, but the objective there was just to see how far can you stretch paint to capture extreme light, like sunrise or sunset light. And those have become bigger paintings that were studio paintings. So I'm not going to say I'm on one or the other side of it. Sometimes I paint to study. Other times I paint to show and to sell.
Yeah, I don't think there's a right or wrong with that. I think each person has a different approach to it. I think artists have benefited from plein air competitions and things like. I don't personally like competition myself, but that's my personal opinion. It's not, I'm not saying that it's the right one. It's just what's good for me. And hearing that conversation with different folks, it even changes over time. Some have painted competitively. And like you said, Matt Smith, I've taken workshops from him. He does like to finish. He likes to finish a work. And when he's finished, it's gallery worthy. Yeah. I've seen it. I've seen him do it. And yet others, I think it was Bill Anton said sometimes they're just studies and there might be 1 or 2 square inches of truth on that plein air painting, but he learns from doing it.
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. You always learn from those studies.
So we've talked a good bit about plein air painting, but I want to explore this a little bit more. What role does outdoor or plein air painting play in your landscape work? Well,
I do, especially in the wintertime, I don't go out as much, so I'm painting indoors more. And that's when I'll develop smaller studies into bigger paintings. I do go out still in the snow, but I try not to go out when it's below 30 degrees because usually nothing good happens. As far as how the sketches that are done outdoor work together with the studio work, I would say that the little pictures, the little sketches definitely bring things back like sounds and smells and the emotional impact. If the sketch has any worth to it, it's going to bring back those feelings. And that does kind of get into the studio work, the emotional impact of having actually been there. I would say that the more often I've painted a scene, like there's scenes out in Utah, I just go back to them over and over again. The more I paint them, the better the studio painting ends up being. Whereas if we all have the experience, you see something, it's gorgeous, you snap a picture of it. And if you take that picture back and you paint it and you haven't really been there, there is kind of a lifelessness. There is sort of a rote rendering quality that can get into that painting.
Yeah, you don't even know what's lies behind that little rise or that hill or behind that barn. There's something about knowing what's behind that adds depth to your understanding of the subject that's before you.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes you don't even know that a thing is two things. There's a formation I'm thinking of in arches. I think they call it the Tower of Babel, and there's something else called the organ. And you can stand on this one viewpoint, and you're staring at the thing, and you think it's this giant wide thing. Actually, it's two things, but you have to drive around a little bit to realize you're looking at two different things. You know,
when you do plein air painting, are you also snapping photos of your surroundings?
If I'm smart, I am. The problem is, it's amazing what things you forget when you're excited and you want to paint this thing right now. I mean, if I'm doing the process right, I start with a photograph of the thing I'm about to paint from life because it's going to help me later. It's going to help me in case the light changes later in the studio. The photo will record things my sketch did, and frequently I forget. But when you're back in the studio and you have both your field sketch and then you got a photograph, you have like the best of both worlds because your sketch is going to show you how to correct a photograph. Particularly, shadows are darkened, lights are blown out, colors are skewed. Also, a photograph. I know people like to say the photograph lies or the photograph isn't true. I would say actually the photograph is true. That's actually a compressed, objective version of reality. The problem is it's not art. We are subjectively recording our optical illusions, our attraction to certain things and repulsion or just plain ignoring other things. The camera doesn't do any of that. So the viewer or the collector want our point of view and personality in the painting. And that's the stuff that happens when you paint from life. Now, when you have not painted from life, I'm just ranting here a little bit. Forgive me for going off on this tangent. But if you have not painted the scene from life and you've got the photograph, and then I try to go back and just paint from the photo, the tendency is to paint everything. But if I have a field sketch and I know that I saw blue back there and I ignored this thing over here entirely, now for some reason that gives me license in the studio to emphasize and de-emphasize the very same things with the photo.
What are some things to keep in mind when you are painting from photos that can help you do a better job?
Sure. Well, the first thing, and this, first of all, I should say the digital photos are way better than the other type, emulsion prints. But even the best color correction of my iPhone is still going to warp color and warp value. So, and as I say, we are painting optical illusions. We are painting the illusion of our own sight more than the quote unquote objective reality of the photograph. So things to keep in mind, your shadows in a photo are always going to be darker and the lights are always going to be a little bit blown out. And here's the weird thing. iPhones don't record. Here's a tip I can actually tell you. iPhones don't take pictures of the lights correctly, but they tend to video the scene a little better. In other words, if you video the scene and take a photo of the scene. And then later on, you take a screenshot of the moving video on your iPhone. That will have better color than the photograph. A screenshot of the video will have better color than the photograph.
That's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wonder what the science is behind that. It is true, though. That's exactly what the iPhone is doing. It's doing a multiburst behind the scenes. You don't even realize it's going on. And then it does a photo stacking or averaging of all those images to create what it thinks is the best average of those photos. So, yeah, it may not be quite the same thing that you see before you.
Sure. One thing I've done, especially out west where you've got an extremely wide gamut. In other words, the brights are glaringly bright and the darks can be very dark, especially in strong, bold sunlight. One thing I'll do is I'll video and look at the screen as I'm videoing and look at the scene, and I will say, okay, the orange on that range is far more toward magenta. The sky is about right, but the ground plane is actually greener. I'll just record my voice, and I can sometimes correct the distortions. It will certainly bring to mind the memory of the scene, and I can correct them in paint.
Now, that's a great tip. You could have essentially video notes of your surroundings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
talking to it. Yeah.
Yeah. Video that you're taking is identical to what you're looking at on the screen while the camera is taking the video.
That is awesome. Good tip. I know we've talked about some of this, but I just want to explore it a little bit more. What do you enjoy about painting outdoors?
I like the quiet, and I especially like to get a little bit off trail wherever I am, because there's always people, especially in places like Arches. You're surrounded. You get a little bit off trail, but not crushing that biocrust that they're always concerned about.
Yeah, they're picky about that.
They are, and they should be. I mean, they should be. But you get a little ways off on a rock or something, and then things start to happen. I think too of that corridor, just the other side of Arches, where the Colorado River cuts up along Route 128. And plenty of places to hike. It's all BLM land, so you're not quite as restricted. But I like being surrounded by whatever might happen. Animals start coming out. I'm kind of big, so I'm not really afraid of a mountain lion or anything. But plenty of times just before the sun rises, and you're sitting there in this silence painting, you get the creepy idea that something might be watching you. I don't mind that. Maybe I've gotten creeped out a couple times and left, but I just like that.
Wait. You got creeped out. Was that by animal or people?
I'm specifically thinking about a noise in the bush. You're painting, and then you suddenly become a little bit aware that there are noises coming from a certain area. It's probably something small. You don't know. I know Josh Bean talks about a deer that came bursting out of the bush and promptly delivered a young right in front of him. I haven't had anything that dramatic happen. Once I do remember I was painting once in the high desert. It was hot, and I was way off the trail. Anyway, I was in front of these crazy formations, and it was probably about 100 degrees out. And, I would take in those days I painted a little faster. I would do 4 a day, right? And I would have a Gatorade per painting. I would make myself drink 32 ounces of Gatorade.
Well, that's a metric of painting I've never heard before. Gatorade.
A Gatorade per panel. Yeah.
Okay.
And I was probably 2 in, because it was probably around
2
noon.
Gatorades. All right.
Yep. Had the big hat on, had the sunscreen and 2 Gatorades in me. And I started in the sunlight, I started seeing something on a corner of my eye. And it looked like, there was some sagebrush over there and rocks, and it looked like it was blurring. If you've ever seen Star Trek, where the Romulans have their cloaking device and they make the stars blur to show you where the spaceship is. The sagebrush was blurring. I thought it was like a heat mirage, but then this blur spot started kind of moving around a little bit. And about that time, I heard this weird buzzing sound. So I got weirded out and finished the painting. And
you sure that was Gatorade you were drinking?
It was. No, it was definitely Gatorade. So stuff like that. When it's happening, it's creepy. When you look back, it's really cool. Another thing too, it wasn't fun when it happened, but not far from where I was just talking about is this place called Onion Creek, which is It's basically an off-road trail that drives over a switchback.
Is that in Arches or in the BLM that surrounds it?
It's in the BLM that surrounds it. It's off Route 128.
Yeah.
So the creek, the road very loosely and very roughly follows the creek. Really, the creek cuts in front of the road over and over again, crisscrosses. And then sometimes the road goes up on this berm, which becomes literally a cliff. Well, at some point, I got this stupid idea. You're looking forward, you're looking backward, and I'm always snapping pictures. And my Jeep, which was just a little Wrangler, kind of got half off the berm. And then I decided, well, I was either going to flip it, in which case I was up a creek, no pun intended, or
oh my goodness,
drive down the berm and try to, in a more controlled setting, get back up onto the road. So that's what I decided to do. I drove down the berm, which is probably about 3 feet. And now there's no place to drive up it. So I spent literally the whole day. I drove the Jeep to the highest point where I still had to get up maybe 2 feet of crushed red sand. I spent the day climbing under the Jeep, lifting it up on my back as an inch or two wherever I could get a little clearance under the wheel, and shoving these flat rocks under the wheels until finally I was able to get enough momentum to get up this berm. And I mean, there was nobody there. There was no cell service. That was not a fun day. But I think your question is, what do I enjoy?
Sounds like you were having a kind of fun.
In retrospect, it's a heck of a memory.
Yeah, I've been in that area, so I can very much visualize what you were going through. And of course, I will admit that the thought went through my head, what were you thinking?
Right. Yeah.
Well, one of the things about plein air painting too that's interesting, the times that I've done it, it always draws the human element. So how do you deal with public curiosity? Does that happen to you?
Absolutely. I mean, especially Arches or around here, Letchworth Park, which is kind of like it's a big canyon, except it's green. And there's always people that stop, and I like it. I'm never disturbed by it. Of course, it's good business too. You pass out cards, and I've made some sales from, well-wishers and interested people. Sometimes I'll give them a little lesson. I'll tell them, I'll load up a brush and find a spot of the painting where they can't do that much damage. And I'll tell them, okay, just put the stroke right there and just kind of move it up and down, and then they'll do it. And, they get a kick out of it.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that.
Yeah. You're asking about the public. It's actually benefited me in other ways. My Facebook photo was taken by a hiker at Arches who just happened to see me, snapped this picture. I gave him a card, and he sent me this photo he took. And so that's my Facebook photo.
Oh, that is wonderful. I love hearing that. I do like painting outdoors. And when the public comes, I like taking a moment to talk to people. I think it's a great opportunity to have a friendly conversation, enlighten them on something that they're very curious about. I mean, how many people stop by you if you're taking a picture of something? Right. Hey, almost no one. But boy, you pull out that easel and those tubes of paint and set up a canvas, they want to know what you're doing, and they enjoy it. They want it. They have questions and stuff, and I just think it's great when artists do that. I've heard the other extreme where people complain very highly about public curiosity.
Well, I've heard it too. In fact, I think on one of your interviews, somebody relates. I've heard a couple people say that people drove by and shouted, "Get a job,"
Yeah, no, I haven't had anybody tell me get a job. Anyway, it's fun though. It's a good outdoor activity, and I can't wait until I can start traveling again. I'll probably be on the road for a year after this pandemic is over.
Yeah, we have our plans, but we're not sure until we're right there.
That's it. Exactly. So we've talked about outdoor painting, but I'd like to get into just painting in general. And I know you take time to teach others about painting and the fundamentals of painting. And could we talk a little bit about what you consider to be the foundations of a good painting?
Well, there's the teachable parts of this, the technical parts, which are easy to communicate. And then there's it's the non-technical, it's the emotional parts, the spiritual parts, which are very difficult to teach or talk about. As far as the technical side, it's values. I would say values have to be simple enough so they read graphically from across the room. The first thing is drawing. I mean, you said the foundations of good painting. You have to, we're assuming we're talking about representational. Drawing skill is the foundation. And then it would be values. As I said earlier, you want to budget your values. In other words, I find painting with 5 values is better than painting with infinite gradations of value, for me anyway. I told you about the whole thing about seeing my own work that kind of got it through my thick head that I was painting too many halftones. So that's the way, if that's the way I'm going to see it, that's the way the possible collector is going to see it on the wall, probably from 10 feet away. And there's going to be a lot of other paintings. So your big value shapes have to reel in the viewer from a good distance across the room. And subtlety is just not going to do that. I would also say painting a lot of things, a lot of information is not going to do that. So simplifying, paint less stuff, more shapes. I would say painting is as much about what you don't paint, removing information, as it is about recording information. So the viewer expects that we're going to edit reality down to what's the good stuff. So we have to do that as painters. As far as the mushy stuff, which is the emotional, spiritual part that is hard to talk about, I just happened to listen to Robert Henry's The Art Spirit on audio, on Audible. I think that's what he was getting at. He was just talking quite a bit about, I would say, the life of a painter, his version of it from his perspective in time. But it was about the personality of making a strong statement, of making a bold picture, not so much from the technical side, but having something to say. And I would say that the painters that I like, which is really all I can talk about, they're pretty much all strong mark makers. Their personality is coming through more than strict fidelity to their subject matter. So there's tactile quality of paint usually. I mean, I always respond to thick, strongly painted work. I don't respond so much to blended out brush marks. And some of that is passion. I mean, you can force yourself to pick up a palette knife and it's going to make a strong mark. So that's a technical thing. But some of it is not technical. Some of it is the emotional impulse that comes, or the courage that comes from stamping your brush on there or making a strong statement. And I would say also the vulnerability or the trust that the viewer is going to get it, and to let your brush strokes stay strong and unblended. And I don't want to say anything against a painter who paints in all the halftones, and nor do I want to say that painting
has its place. Yes,
it has its place, and it's beautiful, and they're not necessarily blending; they're literally painting in the halftone steps, and that's hard. That is its own beautiful style of painting. But we're talking about plein air painting, which is time compressed painting, or we're talking about landscape painting that kind of has been influenced by outdoor painting, and so for me, the aesthetics that govern that type of painting have to do with strong feelings that you have toward the subject that come through in the paint. So that's the kind of expressive power that I see in these older paintings or these older artists that always grab me, and I'm trying to do it myself.
Well, if I were to stand in your studio or stand behind your plein air box and just watch you perform, what would I see transpire from setting up your canvas and beginning your mark making? What would I see happen?
Well, first you see me walking around a long time, or driving around, right? Or driving around. I like to start before the light gets to the final place. So that's either before the sun rises, or if I know the area, before the sun is in the right place. Around here, it means I'm driving around miles of farmland waiting for the sun to pop up over the horizon. And so I'll try to get my car in a nice place where I can either watch the sun come up over interesting landforms. I tend to paint backlit subjects. It's just a thing I'm attracted to, I guess. And I'll try to whip out a few small sketches, maybe as many as 3 or 4 on little 6x8 panels. Then I'll turn my GPS on so I can get myself back home. I don't always know where I've been. The GPS knows, and if you've taken a photograph, it tells you where you were too. So you can get back there, but you got to look at the photo you took. As far as the way I paint out west, or even around here, like at Letchworth, that's different. That starts with a standard backpack full of supplies and hiking around, and I'm cropping with my fingers to see possible compositions, and I'm squinting. If the thing I'm interested in does not withstand squinting at it, if it disappears, I don't paint it. I know some others can paint stuff that disappears when they squint, and it'll be a good picture. But for me, if the patterns don't withstand squinting, I move on. And then I set up. For me, setting up is really important that it be fast. So I've got an easel that a local woodworker built. It's Oak Hill woodworking. Everything's in this one pallet box. And so I just set up my tripod, plop my box on my tripod, and flip it open. And I am painting. Literally within 2 minutes. I try to take every obstacle out of the way to get me from car to painting. And so, I mean, I hate to talk about kit and material, but for me, it's like really important that it is up and running like immediately.
I think talking about kit is, to me, it's kind of fun because exactly. It's like a first time traveler going overseas. They're going to pack 3 suitcases thinking they need to take everything. but you have to kind of explore what other people do to find out, oh yeah, I don't need to do that. I can take the carry-on bag and this pair of shoes and, roll up my clothes this way to keep them from getting wrinkled. So there's some benefit to at least knowing what's in the kit and the reasons why. And quick setup, I think, is an important thing. I don't like friction. The least friction I can have, the more inclined I am to do it. If there's too much friction, and I'm overcoming the inertia of the couch is going to be much harder.
Absolutely. And I think it's also the type of painter that you are. I know there are painters that produce great work with a old-fashioned French easel and all that implies about the trial of setting up, as well as the time investment. I'm the other kind of painter, which is I'm hoping to get, I'm a full day of painting from sunset to sunrise. I'm hoping for maybe 5, maybe even more. And I know out of that, a couple might be good and then a couple won't be. And so I've got to just get up and running immediately. And for me, a French easel is not going to do it.
So you've got it set up and you're ready to go. I mean, what happens now? Do you make marks for your drawing? I want to understand what happens at this point.
Gotcha. I'll try to make it simple. There's two roads, the fast or the slow, and it's determined by light. If it's sunrise or sunset, the fast road is I immediately get my colors out. I've got a paint saver here, also made by the woodworker guy, Oak Hill Woodworking. Paint comes out, I paint immediately. I don't pre-mix. Those are beginning of the day, end of the day. And the process is about the same, so I'll talk about the process later. If it's the middle of the day, which is the predominance of the day, I start with a marker sketch using, 3 values of marker. I'll use black and then 2 grays, a light one and a dark one, and a ballpoint pen. I'll get that sketch to figure out what are my big value patterns. If something's not working, I may quit. Usually I don't. I usually continue, but I may change based on that marker sketch. I'll put the marker sketch aside and so that I can see it. My palette is a standard split primary, a warm and a cool of each of the primaries. And I throw a few tertiary colors on there, just convenience colors that I like. I actually have a paint saver so that they're already laid out on this little gizmo that's inside of a kind of an airtight tube, which works nicely. That's also made by the woodworker that makes my palette box. So I slide the paint tray out, snap it into place on the palette box, and there's my colors. I might have to refill one or two. And what I'll do is pull colors out, pre-mix them according to the major shapes that I see in the scene. So, I mean, for example, what am I talking about? Let's say you're looking at, rock spires, a background, the sky, and a foreground. I'm going to mix a sky, a tone, maybe two, because there's maybe a gradation. So I'll get those colors mixed. I set them down on my palette. I actually mix my colors on I'm picking it up as I'm talking. A putty knife. I'll have the putty knife in my left hand and my palette knife in my right. I'll mix the colors on the putty knife, slide them off, put them on the palette, and then move on to the next zone, so that my pre-mixtures, generally about 12 to 15, are all laid out on my palette more as a staging area than as my mixing area. So that palette, it gives me an opportunity to correct values before I put them on the canvas. In other words, we've all experienced where we've inverted a value relationship on the canvas. Oh man, I overmodeled the trees. The trees are too bright against the background. The trees are really much darker. I don't usually have that problem because the values are correct on my palette as to their internal relationships. And there's nothing wrong, by the way. If I discover I've got too many halftones, I'll sometimes pick a color up off my palette and darken it or lighten it so that the colors are organized on my palette before I paint.
Realistically, I mean, this takes a bit of time to do.
Yeah. Well, I 20 minutes.
20 minutes. Okay.
Yeah. It's done. 20 minutes and it's pre-mixed. Sometimes if I'm going fast, I can probably do it in 10. This is the part where years of painting, years of opaque color mixing are, they're at my fingertips. It wasn't always this way, Carl. I mean, I remember when I first transitioned from watercolor to oil painting, I had no idea how to mix opaque color. And I mean, I would struggle for half a day not knowing what I was doing. But at this point, I know my colors pretty well. So pre-mixing is pretty quick. And then just to move on, because you wanted to know what would happen next, I will, there's two ways for me to start a painting. One is to do a quick monochrome and basically a quick wash painting using usually a brown, which I'll correct by kind of wiping it with a solvent dipped rag. That's a Nelson Shanks thing. That's what we did in his portrait atelier. But so I'll either start with a monochrome wash and wiping out where I need to correct the drawing, or I will start with kind of a linear pattern of where the major shapes are, basically the major value shapes or the major overlaps of the scene. I would say it's funny. I mean, I'm aware of how other people paint too, and I'm curious about it. I know a lot of painters think in terms of this shape overlaps that shape, overlaps that shape. Very often I'm squinting and I'm seeing the abstraction. So I'm seeing large value patterns and kind of the tilts and the angles of the scene relative to the implied rectangle of my canvas. So I'm always judging a true vertical and a degree of a tilt from that true vertical or that true horizontal. Then I'll get the thing laid out, and then I slap the color on there, and I try to get the thing covered. I try to make all the white of the canvas go away, and then I'll sit back and evaluate what needs more detail, what needs sharper edges, where my contrasts are weak. And then the hardest part is to stop before you put too many small forms in. I've actually learned a lot by watching my own time-lapse videos, because I can see, where the paintings sometimes go south. You can literally say, okay, that's when the painting was strongest. And then you put 20 more minutes of work in, and it becomes a very noisy painting with details. So I don't know if you're doing this, Carl. Do you ever wish there was an undo button? You could just click undo and it would.
Yeah, I'm thinking about all these wonderful paintings I have that used to be wonderful.
Yeah.
because you didn't know to leave, or I didn't know to leave things alone. Just, it's good. Mark is down, move on, or stop.
Right. It's worse when you've filmed the process and when you can literally say that was the strongest painting, 20 minutes before the end, and now you've got a painting that you don't even know if you want to show it. But it is a learning process. It's been very good. I think it was Richard Schmidt, I think, said that in his Alla Prima book, he said very often he thought his paintings were at their very strongest point, just a little bit past the block end. And I would agree. I think that's true with my own work as well.
Chris, I'm always curious about what a painter chooses to paint on, what they paint with, the tools that they use. To me, it's a lot like a musician. You can have one guy that has a saxophone, but there's so many different models, so many different reeds, so many different styles and ways of doing things. And I love it. I love the choices that people make. So I want to peer into your studio and your mind a little bit and find out, what do you like to paint with? What are the instruments that you perform with?
Well, I like a rough canvas. And so I discovered this accidentally. I was using the pre-made kind. I got to use the Fredericks. I think they call it the Fredericks Pro or the Fredericks Archival. I think it's the same thing. It's a nice rough canvas, maybe just a little too rough. I think it's the Dixie something canvas, whatever, but it gives you the full range. You can, if you're going to use a knife, you can completely get a smooth passage that has no texture. Or if you're scrubbing with a brush or you're doing kind of a scrapey, scumbly thing, even with a knife, then that rougher canvas texture comes through and you can get broken color effects. I loved it, but I didn't love that I was painting on canvas. And also there were just one or two little issues with the surface.
That was a cotton surface, right? The Dixie is cotton.
It was a cotton surface. Nothing wrong with that.
No.
The other thing too is the price. So I started figuring out, well, could I make my own linen panels? And so I did. I buy what's called wainscot, or I think they call it marker board. Essentially, it's masonite with a white surface on the back. So you've got a really nice professional white surface, and then the other side is masonite, which I sand to open it. And I glue down raw linen, and I use the actually I don't have the information in front of me, but there's a place over, I don't know, it's an internet place where I buy the rolls of linen. I'll glue it down with acrylic medium, although I probably will change that. Coat it with acrylic medium, do a little work on the linen to sand it, and then I coat it with, actually put more acrylic medium on it at that point, and then I put Winsor Newton oil primer. And I'm telling you, it's the best surface I've ever worked on. I know Raymar's canvases are also just terrific. I think mine are as good. I don't know if I'm always going to have the time and energy to devote to making these, because obviously they do take time. But
well, I was going to say you're pretty courageous to take raw linen and do that. Well, it's not a criticism. I tried it not too long ago, and I think part of it was my frustration because I'd never done it before. But that's the reason I did it. I said, okay, I'm going to take this piece of raw linen from Fredericks, and I'm going to size it, mount it, prime it, and oh my goodness, that turned into a long project. And then I had to wait for the oil primer to dry, so before you could paint on it.
Yeah,
it's a trade-off, but it is fun in a way to make your own stuff.
Well, it's not fun when you're doing it, but it's fun afterwards. It's fun to know I made this, and it's also cool to be able to get the feedback between you made it, you painted on it, and then you want to go back later and adjust it. I want to fill this in more. Oh, I didn't put enough oil primer on, or I put too much primer on, and get it just right. So as I say, I may end up buying like Raymar or Source Tech, but for now, I like what I make myself. My brushes, I buy them from Rosemary, and I buy them from, I think it's called West Wind or Wind River. Wind River Fine Arts. As far as what brushes, I pretty much use Rosemary Brights. I use what they call their Ultimate Brights. And I bought some of their other ones that splay. And I found out that even though they don't come to as nice of an edge as the Ultimate bristle, I still like those too because they give you a less precise edge, kind of a rough edge. I also like these, what are they called? They're super cheap. It's black silver by Dynasty. It's just a super cheap, wide, flat, but it gives you some really precise marks. So I like a range of different marks with my brushes. As far as my paint, I've used them all. I mean, I've used every brand. They're all good. Some are better. I like softer paint. And because I paint quite a bit, I also I'm sensitive to, price. So for me right now, Shiva by Jack Richardson is pretty much the oil paint of choice. It is generally soft enough from the tube, highly pigmented. I have no problem with their cadmiums. I know some have issues because they precipitate their cadmiums with a little barium. A lot of cadmiums are actually precipitated with barium. Not everybody admits it. The super elite paint brands do not. You have the most highly refined cadmiums there, but
how do you find that out? I use Gamblin a good bit, so I'm not sure what their process is.
Yeah, and I haven't researched whether or not they are using cadmiums precipitated with barium. But in any event, the whole objective here is to get tinting strength and coverage. There's no problem with tinting strength or coverage with Shiva paint, and more importantly, there's no problem adjusting the viscosity from the tube with one or two slight exceptions. They all squeeze out, ready to be manipulated. And I just don't have time for loosening up my paint with some kind of a medium if I'm racing with the light. So there are other brands, super elite brands, and we know their names, that are so thick with pigment that for me, they're utterly useless. So Shiva is the best. I will say that their ultramarine blue right now, they may change the formulation, but right now I find it a little too stiff. And so for that color, as well as burnt umber, I go to M. Graham because they're soft enough and they're oily enough. Or aside from brushes, I like painting with knives as well, which is just, I would say, more this year than any other year. It's kind of a big clunky tool for rendering, and so it doesn't really render small forms well, which is part of what I like about it. It keeps me big and broad.
Well, I'm curious about the knife usage. Do you just make the decision, well, this painting I'm going to do exclusively with a knife, or is it a tool that you use along with your brushes?
Yes to both, and I haven't sorted out where palette knife work is going to end up being in my work. At this point, it's still new enough so that I haven't yet decided what it's best for or what it's not good for. Sometimes a whole painting is knife and I like it. Sometimes I'm not as happy, but a knife seems to be able to say quite a bit with less detail. It just puts a solid color patch down. It tends to create, for me, more interesting edges at the boundary of the mark. Brush marks, if you think about the way they make a mark, they're nebulous at the edge. You can make a strong line with a brush, but generally the way the thousands of little paint bristles, when they depart from the surface, you're going to get a diffused edge. A knife creates a completely unpredictable broken edge. It's a hard edge, but it's a broken hard edge. And so those marks, to me, they just have more possibility about what I can do with them than a brush. So maybe the honeymoon will end and I'll be like, okay, I'm only going to use the knife for this, this, and this. But right now, the knife is pretty exciting.
Well, at least you're experimenting, right? That's how we grow as artists.
Yeah.
Chris, what contemporary or past artists inspire you?
It's all the same ones, it's Sargent, it's Sorolla, I like Bastien Lepage, Fashion. I like Maynard Dixon, but I like a lot of people that have painted. I would say if I could characterize the ones who move me the most, they're the painters who have the stronger personalities or the stronger aesthetics that came through over fidelity to the subject matter, or I should say over rendering small forms. So it's these painters who have distinctive, strong aesthetics, I guess, style that I guess move me the most, both in the past and in the present. And you said present, so I've got names, there's a lot I could mention. Right now, I'm really liking these Russian painters, and there's a guy named Daniel Volkov. He's a palette knife painter. I guess he paints on cardboard or something. I thought it was a mistranslation, like it must be masonite. No, it really is cardboard. He's painting on cardboard. These are fantastic paintings. I mean, they're really, really good. And then there's Roman B. Zubkov, if I'm saying his name. He's pretty impressive. Julia Kostova. Yeah, she just paints these huge paintings right there, and she films herself too on Instagram. Terrific work. Scott Christensen, I would say, got me into sort of the way I paint. I never studied with him, but certainly what he published on a website maybe 20 or more years ago, just his simple, clear-headed approach to painting definitely has affected the way I think about it, about painting landscape. And then all the painters that we know and love, like Skip Whitcomb. Jill Carver is another painter whose palette knife work has just, impressed me, caused me to change what I do. I also mentioned Matt Smith, the three Joshes, right? Josh Clare, Josh Elliott, Josh Bean. And there's a gal right now, Julia Davis, and I've been looking at the way she's been studying tree shapes, and I tell you, it's pretty impressive.
Now, I have not heard of her. I'll have to look her up. Yeah,
it's worth looking up. She definitely has a strong, unique view of how to approach painting. And there's this guy too, watercolors, Christopher Buchholz. I think I'm saying his name right. Buchholz. Watercolors that are so bold. I would put him, kind of in the Sargent watercolor category. These painters all kind of ride the edge, I would say, between realism and impressionism, and they all have, I would say, a unique view, a unique personality that comes through in their work. I would also say this. And this is what I've been thinking about a lot this year, Carl, is like randomness. What is the place for randomness in our work? Because we're all representational painters, but we all like to put dither or some type of unpredictability in our work. And so I think of all the ways that we stick randomness in by crazy texture or underpainting, or some people paint a painting on top of a painting. There's a painter named Lynn Bogus or Bogus, I don't know how to say his name, Boggess.
He's a knife painter, right?
He is. And the thing that he's made me think about, probably more than any other painter, is this edge between total random chaos and hyper-realism. And what I think it boils down to is he's able to deduce just how much mileage he can get out of the small random effects of material movement, like knife edge movement or random things that happen with paint motion. He's able to deduce exactly how much of that he can get away with and cause the viewer to turn it into hyper-realistic stuff within a very controlled, larger pattern of, like, the values are right, the colors are right. So, I mean, he's really got me thinking about, like, what can you get away with random noise? Because I think we as viewers, putting myself in the not in my painting shoes, but in the viewer shoes, I think we love to see a painting that's on the edge of not making sense snap into hyper reality. So,
but this whole idea of randomness, it's really hard for humans to do.
Yeah,
it's hard. I mean, even computers have a hard time. They struggle with it. Random number generators are an oxymoron because there's
and that's the thing, Carl. I think of it as writing. I do some writing too. And idea generation is over here. Editing is over there. Both are creative acts. And so if you're always in the position of the creating, but not in the position of the editing, you're missing part of the creative process. So I think putting some random noise in lets you occupy the shoes of the editor and say, okay, how much of this can stand in for blank grass, stuff on the ground? But, like Lynn, for example, he's got randomness standing in for almost everything. It's Lynn Bogus who paints with all that randomness and somehow pulls it off. And I wish I knew how to say his name, Boggess.
Yeah, I do. I remember the first time I saw his work. I know painters they don't always like the expression from the public when they say, oh, that looks just like a photo.
Right.
But I did have that impression. The first time I saw one of his paintings, it was just, of course, it's the way we look at things, right? You're on Instagram, scroll. Oh, yeah, that looks cool. Scroll. And I saw one of his paintings and it just made me stop and say, wow, that's a nice photo. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah. That's not a photo. Right. and that randomness and those knife marks and things like that you're talking about, the way he did it caused me to stop.
Right.
And take a second look.
Yeah, to me, that's like like an endless well of creative stimulation or creative thought, which is to ask yourself the question, why does that type of painting teeter on the edge of more real than real and chaos at the same time? I go back to it and I think about it and it inspires, creative ways of painting.
So as I listen to you, Chris, you sound like a teacher, somebody that teaches a lot and enjoy teaching. And of course, I've noticed on your work on your website, you mentioned that you do conduct workshops. Are you still doing that on a regular basis?
Yeah. I teach weekly classes. Students, they join the virtual classes, which are right now Zoom classes, or they can stream them later. I have a number of people that just they watch them as recordings. They slow them down, they paint, and then they send me the work, and I critique it. As far as the class, I pretty much teach stuff that we've already talked about, breaking down a composition into simple shapes. I try to do it step by step so that the students have time to do the thing that I just demoed. So we mix the colors in one step, then I start to apply them to the canvas and, I insert time so that the students can keep up. I would say Zoom has been eye-opening. It's let me see how to really slow down my brush work or palette knife work, what have you, to really talk about how I'm touching the surface, how I'm moving, and then how I'm lifting off the surface. This is stuff I've never been able to do in live demonstrations. And then at the end of the class, the students get to show each other their work. I'll give a critique, and then usually the paintings are not done at the end of class, but what they'll do is email me their finals and then post them on Facebook. We got a class Facebook page, and I'll critique the work there so everybody can see each other's work and read the different critiques. That's the virtual way that I teach. Warmer weather, I teach right outside all around Monroe County, New York, which is where I live. What I'll do is notify students the day before where we're going to go, and it's kind of weather dependent. Sometimes we're going to have to do a virtual class instead of a outdoor class because it's raining. And those are the traditional way. Start with a demonstration, and then everyone breaks out their easels and goes around and sets up. And then I will make the rounds to each easel and provide suggestions to the students.
Very nice.
Yeah. As far as out west, I do teach workshops, traditional 2 or 3 day workshops, both around Moab, Utah, as well as up on the Colorado National Monument. This year, I'm intending to take the virtual classes with me, so to speak, and just kind of run them from those outdoor painting locations. I'm working on the technology of how to make that happen, but I think that'll be really cool. That way, all the students can join either live or stream the recorded class if they want.
I think that's a neat idea. I don't know that I've seen anybody actually do that yet. Can you imagine, Chris, going out to Colorado National Monument, standing at Artist Point, assuming you got a good cell phone signal, and conducting a live stream right there as you do it? That would be pretty cool.
Well, that's the plan, and you've got it. It boils down to line of sight. I can't be far from a cell tower, or it's not going to work.
Yeah. So much for Canyonlands. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I have one other question. I love to ask people this who teach, because it's not just about who's a good teacher, but what makes a good student. How can I be a better student?
Well, we said already the basics. Learn. Polish up your drawing. Taking classes with somebody who you like. Painting from life. All the stuff we've said. Painting big shapes, not small shapes. I would also say, not taking any of it too seriously. Embrace your failure. I've had to do that switching over to knife painting, which was kind of like jumping out of a plane without a parachute. It was just do it and see what happens. Understand that you're not going to like your work for large swaths of time. And so what you have to do is just love the act of painting and love the idea that you're learning about painting more than praise or money or showing even showing your work, which you may not choose to do when you make big changes. Now, you've asked being a better student. This is a tough part because painting is expensive, but I would say put a lot of paint on. I mean, if you need to buy really cheap paint, then buy cheap paint, but put a lot of paint on and make a lot of paintings.
And wouldn't it stand to reason to go ahead and start painting with good materials too? I mean, not just the paints, but a good brush, a good surface.
Yeah, absolutely. As good as you can afford. But I got to do this psychological thing with myself. I load myself up with paint. Like, I'm not even going to tell you how much paint I have. And that is for me what I have to do to set myself loose, to put out as much paint as I think I need to.
There goes that cadmium red. It's $30 a tube. Oh, yeah. That's $1 a dollop.
Absolutely. So if you're buying, leave the ultra elite paint to the people who have a very sure batting average with their painting. If you're learning to be a good student, buy a lot of paint and go through it and expect that you're going to throw a lot of it out. And I was thinking of my son Harrison, and he, as far as being a good student, I'm different than he was. When I was a kid, I would polish a painting to whatever my 8-year-old mind thought of as perfection, and I would stay on that painting for a long time. I learned to draw, but I learned to draw kind of slowly. Harrison puts out drawing after drawing after drawing, and they're half-finished drawings. Sometimes they're finished, then he's on to the next thing. And his drawing ability has skyrocketed. So as far as what do we learn? I would say many small studies train you faster than a few perfected studies. So you just do lots of little studies and get all the bad paintings out of your system, and these good paintings are going to start to come. And then I would say this is a big thing, Carl. If I could have known early in my painting career what type of aesthetic I was going to eventually be drawn to, I would have saved a lot of time. So as early as you can, start to think critically about what type of artists you're drawn to and identify what it is about that artist. Like, okay, are you always drawn to the French academic painters like Bouguereau and Alma Tadema and Gérôme? That says something about where you should go. Or are you always drawn to, Bastien Lepage or Sorolla kind of thinking? Well, that should tell you something too. And it's not if you're not doing, what should I say? We want to be very broad-minded and like everything, which is fine. But there's nothing wrong with just eliminating all these artists from the ones that you're going to target. You're going to focus on this narrower sliver. And that's where you're going to, find your inspiration for your own personal aesthetic. I've kind of only begun doing that recently, and I wish I had done that earlier.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that. It is true if we could do that, but I have to be frank. When I first got interested in art, I didn't really know what I would want to paint. I was drawn to some very eclectic things, and I still am. It's a challenge because there's a part of me wants to do that eclectic stuff and other more traditional stuff and something in between. I want to try it all.
Right.
And but yeah, you're right. In order to learn, you got to focus. So
And you can love it. There's a Bouguereau right here in our local museum. I think it's called the Sea Princess or the Sea. I don't know what it is. It's a girl in a pink dress holding like a I don't know, like an Aquaman spear or something. And it is fabulous. It's a late Bouguereau, so it's a little bit looser and it's awesome. And I mean, I stand in front of it as long as I stand in front of anything in that museum. I'm not going to paint that way, but there's nothing wrong with loving it.
Of course. Of course. Chris, we can't visit every single museum throughout the world. So sometimes we have to do the next best thing. And that's, get on the internet, or my favorite is looking at a physical art book. Do you have any that you recommend?
Absolutely. But I got to go back to what you said about looking at work on the internet. I really think Instagram has changed the way I paint. And simply because if I was to curate my own people that I'm interested in, it would be limited to what I know or what I could research in the known channels, right? Instagram, though, just stuff popped up. So I've really, like some of these modern Russian painters, I've really learned a lot through, I would say, a targeted and purposeful use of social media, because you can also waste your whole day as well.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
But I have learned a lot about artists I would not otherwise know. But as far as books, the simple ones that we all know, I mean, I haven't picked up any kind of a magical book. So it's Carlson's Guide to Landscape Painting for sure. It's worth all the praise that's heaped on it. I would also say Alla Prima by Richard Schmid it's full of really clear-headed painting advice. It's as good as everybody says it is. I enjoyed all of Kevin McPherson's books, and I've thoroughly enjoyed. I just listened to the audiobook. It's called The Painted Word by Tom Wolfe. Have you ever read that or listened?
No. The Painted Word by Tom Wolfe.
By Tom Wolfe, right. Not a guy who comes up in art conversations. I mean, he wrote The Right Stuff and a bunch of other things, but it's for anybody who's into representational painting. It's a short listen, probably 2.5 hours. It's absolutely worth listening to. It's funny. But the gist of it is it's about him making the discovery while he was reading the New York Times that the pop art scene that he was referring to, or just, I think it was just pre-pop art. It was some kind of post-expressionism that he was looking at, was not understandable unless it came with a theory or a text. And that blew his mind, because that was part of the resistance to representational painting at the end of at the beginning of the 20th century, was that all of the representational painting was depending upon a text, either biblical or mythological or literary, and that was low art. And here, all these years later, come to find out, the most modern of modern art was absolutely as dependent upon a text or a written theory, usually by somebody who was writing art criticism, and in a few cases, people that were actually financially tied to the modern art market. Anyway, we're off in the weeds, but
we go.
It's a good one.
I'll have to check that out. I haven't heard of it, so I'm going to. Oh, there goes my wallet once again. Well, where's the best place people can find out about you, Chris?
Well, my website, chriskolupski.com. I post my work for sale as well as my class schedules on the website. I show a little more work on Instagram, sketchier stuff. That would be at Chris Kolupski Art. And I also post lots of time-lapse videos that show pretty much how I paint. Some of them are a little bit more experimental.
That's on YouTube?
Yeah. It's not yet on YouTube. It's Instagram.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
At Chris Kolupski Art. There's only one Chris Kolupski as far as I know. So if you put me in there, it's going to get you to my Instagram feed.
And I'll provide links too as well.
But I would say the timeless videos have been instructive both to me as well as students, because they do let you see the process, and in some cases they reveal mistakes, places where I should have stopped. So it's cool to see the struggle of painting, as it happens.
Well, thank you for sharing both your struggles and your joys of painting today. I really appreciate you being on The Artful Painter today.
Well, thank you, Carl. It's been a lot of fun.
I want to express my deepest gratitude to Chris Kolupski for taking the time to talk with me and allowing me to share this conversation with you here on The Artful Painter. I have links to his website, his social media, as well as some of the other things that we talked about in the show notes for this episode. Be sure to check it out. I'd like to leave you with a bit of inspiration from Burge Harrison and his book, Landscape Painting. This is from the chapter, Character. A portion of it reads this way. It says, if you should ask a dozen painters what mental qualification was most essential to an artist's success, the chances are that every man of them would reply, temperament. In other words, genius and imagination. Transposed, these terms all mean the same thing, a peculiarly sensitive subconscious organization, one that is at once keenly alive to beauty and capable of that rapid and intuitive coordination of impressions whose visible and tangible result is the work of genius. And, in a way, the painters would be right, for without temperament no man can be an artist, but temperament alone will not suffice. If I were myself asked to supply a formula for the making of an artist, my receipt would be 1 part genius and 9 parts hard work. And on that note, I encourage everyone to get your paintbrushes, your palette knives, whatever it is you paint with, even if it's a stick, and go make a mark on something, okay? Get out there and paint. I'll see you all in the next edition of The Artful Painter.
Picture on the TV.